Welcome to Unpacking Armenian Studies. This is a podcast series of the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies. And this particular limited series we're calling Ukraine, Armenia, and War. And throughout the previous episodes, we've discussed aspects of the war that are both directly and indirectly related to what happened in the Caucasus in 2020, beginning with Azerbaijan's attack on Armenians of Karabakh, and of course, what happened after. Sometimes neither I nor my guest have even said Armenia in these episodes, but the context is, I think, clear, obvious. When we've talked about questions of sovereignty, well, that seems to be a major outcome of this current conflict. And what does sovereignty even mean anymore if it does not include the inviolability of borders? The answers to that question naturally will be history making for Armenians of Karabakh and Armenia. In our other episodes, the Ukrainian diaspora's responses to the war, the views from Iran, from Georgia, from Turkey, the economic and monetary fallout for the Caucasus, and two of my favorites, the voices and explanations of Armenia's two ambassadors on the front line, one in Ukraine and the other in Poland. All of them offer a very specific special prism through which to try to understand this current seismic geopolitical event that we're all living through. Today, we're going to talk directly about Armenia, Armenia and Europe, Europe and Armenia. My guest is Vicken Cheterian, a Lebanese-born journalist and author who teaches international relations at Webster University Geneva. He is a columnist for the Istanbul-based weekly Agos, and you've heard Vicken throughout the Network Nation podcast series, which the Institute disseminated right after the 2020 war. Dr. Cheterian is also the author of several books, among them War and Peace in the Caucasus. Welcome, Vicken.
Hello, Salpi. Good to talk to you.
Thank you. Vicken, at the end of the day, this podcast series really is about war and peace, both in Ukraine and the Caucasus, because clearly both the process of waging this war and the outcome, whatever that eventually is, have and will signal a great deal about how war is fought, tolerated, perceived, resolved in the 21st century. Let's start with Europe. What do Europe's reactions to this war seem to be saying about what Europe will or won't tolerate? After all, that was and continues to be what victims and sympathizers look to. What is Europe saying and what is it doing?
Well, until the 23rd of February this year, Europeans were conscious that there's a problem in the East, that Russia, and especially Russian President Putin, was not very happy. But basically, no one was expecting a war on the European continent. We were just slowly moving out of the pandemic, and the main concerns were still related to that. So the war in Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine was a big shock. And this shock it basically went against everything Europe was trying to do, not only since the end of the Cold War, but also since the end of the Second World War. Europe was trying to build collaboration, cooperation, and eventually peace on the continent, this continent that witnessed two world wars, through economic cooperation. And key European countries like Germany, especially under Merkel, had attempted to develop very close economic collaboration with Russia, hoping that this will be the bridge bringing Russia to closer to Europe. And in spite of Russia being outside security arrangements, outside the European Union, nevertheless, Russia will feel that it has interest in Europe and eventually create channels of collaboration. So the Russian invasion went against all of that. It went against EU's spirit and philosophy. It went against what the Europeans were trying to build for decades. And the war very much polarized Europe. So today, the general mood in Europe is radically against what Russia is doing in Ukraine, against this invasion. And as a result, there's very limited space to debate, to think, to say, okay, there's this war, but nevertheless, we still need to keep certain channels of communication with Russia, with Russians, because eventually, I think the European interest is to end this war as soon as possible, because every day Ukrainians are paying a terrible price. Cities are being destroyed, people are being massacred. And the shortest way to do that is to find a way to convince Russian decision makers to stop this war and to pull back from Ukraine.
So there's a military conflict on the ground, and Europe's chosen solution is what? A mix of military and diplomacy, no military. And you spoke about polarization. The polarization is not that this war is good or bad, or which side are we on, Russia or Ukraine, but what to do about it.
This polarization is very much opposing Russia's invasion. In the past, there were many people in Western Europe who were much more favorable towards Russia, towards Mr. Putin and his policies. Today, those voices have no place. They cannot have public presence. And Europeans tried to react by giving Ukrainians certain means to resist, sending weapons, sending missiles, anti-tank, anti-aircraft missiles, which are very efficient against Russian armor, and they are hurting Russian military. But more than that, Europeans reacted in the European way, which is imposing very harsh sanctions on Russia. Russian economy will not be the same. But at the same time, they kept certain collaboration, economic collaboration. For example, Russian gas and oil are still imported because Europeans depend on Russian energy for their own economic well-being. So yes, European response to this war was military, economic, as well as diplomatic. Until today, French president maintains regular telephone contact with the Kremlin. And I think this is very important because European interest is, as I said, end the war as soon as possible.
Essentially, what has happened with this war is that, as you said, the first part of what happened is that it destroyed all of Europe's thoughts about how rapprochement and more growing and developing and prospering along a more similar path would develop. But the other thing it's done is also change Europe's attitudes about itself and its own societies and how they will develop. This return to militaristic talk, to actual budgets changing, policy definition of national interest changing. The war has succeeded in changing ideology in Europe.
That's what it seems, because European states discovered that they don't have the military means. Apart from France, there's no major army on the European continent that can face Russian armed forces. And the most significant decision here was the German decision to rearm itself, to spend 100 billion euros on armament, and to invest 2% of its economy yearly for military purposes.
For defensive purposes.
For defensive purposes, I mean military purposes. I don't know what is defensive and what is offensive. I mean, military is military. And this will change Germany, and this will change the European Union radically, because the consensus on the European continent since the Second World War was a Germany which does not have an army, a Germany which is an economic power and not a military power. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine is changing that. And that idea was the cornerstone on which the European collaboration and the European Union was founded. So if Germany rearms itself, what will remain of the European collaboration? What will remain of the European Union and the entire European experiment since 1945, where soft power was more important than hard military power? So all those issues are open questions for which we have no answers. We are navigating in dark seas for the moment.
One of the reasons the European dream experiment had a chance of not just working, but had a chance even as a dream, was because the conceptualization was done by victors. And the majority of the first round of the European Union were the victors in these European land wars that came earlier in the 20th century. With today's European Union, where the memories of so many of the member countries are about being victims of a bigger power's aggression, now with applications by Ukraine, by Moldova, by Georgia, the Baltics are already members. Now where the almost dominant ideology is one of defend yourself because no one else will. What happens to the European Union?
Yes, the reasons why Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia want to join the European Union are very different, fundamentally different from the basis on which the principles on which the EU was founded, which was against arming itself. It was a European Union which was basically economic collaboration. In the 90s, and since the 90s, it went towards more financial direction, becoming very neoliberal. But the defensive part, although the EU has also in its treaty some defensive elements, but the defensive part, the military part of the European continent was delegated to NATO, and specifically to the US. So today this is changing, and how the process will be managed when we have a war at the same time, where the future of Russia, it's not very clear. Will Putin and Putin's system survive this war or not? What will happen after Putin as a leader of Russia disappears from the scene? So all those questions are very open. What will happen to Turkey? Turkey, which is also another very important element on the European continent. So all those issues are very much open, and I think everything will depend on how the war in Ukraine will develop and what form it will take.
This newfound, maybe not newfound, but newly loudly articulated adversarial position that Europe has now taken regarding Russia, for obvious reasons, puts small countries, not just because they're small, but certain small countries like Moldova, like Georgia, even Ukraine, but it's too late now for that discussion, in a very difficult position. And of course, I'm going down the road towards Armenia as well. That is, that countries that ought not to have to choose, or countries that if they played it wisely would have perhaps in another era found a way to maintain relations both with the West and with Russia, now are going to find that even harder, right? Given Europe's categoric attitude towards Russia.
Yes, that is the case. Of course, we have polarization. Some people are talking about a Cold War. I don't think it will be something similar to the Cold War, but it's evident that the minimal collaboration that existed since Russia invaded Crimea and annexed Crimea and then invaded Donbass. So Europeans still, in spite of that, they tried to maintain certain collaboration with Russia. And that collaboration today is not possible anymore. And this will bring very harsh polarization, and countries like Georgia have already chosen, they want more of Europe and more of the West. For countries like Moldova and Armenia, it's much more complex. So I think, in spite of everything, we still have to debate about why Europe failed. And because today the only answer seems to be, let's invest on the military, let us put billions into armament. And I think there should be also a debate within Europe, within the European Union, about missed opportunities, because eventually we had 30 years to pay attention to Ukraine, to Russian-Ukrainian relations, to the Caucasus, and I think European diplomacy, European political thinking was absent. So this war is also the result of Europeans not being present enough and not being alert enough to the problems to the east of their borders, and today we are paying the price.
At the very, very beginning, when you began by saying, this is an indication of Europe's failure after 30 years of, on and on, I was going to interrupt and say it is in part a failure of recognizing the importance of culture and ideologies, because the ideology that drove all this was economic prosperity will trump all. Let's make economic prosperity possible. And countries like Armenia have been saying to Europe, for example, that has invested a great deal in economic and structural reforms in Armenia. But countries like Armenia have been saying, look, we need investment in education, and we need investment in media. We need investment in the societal infrastructure that will lead us to that wise place where we can be peaceful in a very difficult region. And I don't know if Europe has invested in that way in many of these places, not just Armenia. And will it see that now that it has, again, categorically taken on this adversarial, defensive, I think not offensive yet, position?
Yes, I think there were a number of missed chances. Of course, Europe in the 90s was very busy with the wars in the Balkans, with the ex-Yugoslav wars, and it didn't invest enough attention towards Russia. For sure, the Caucasus was outside its sphere of attention. But I think Ukraine was very much neglected and for more than a decade. It was only after the Orange Revolution of 2003 where Europeans realized that there's this huge country, very important to its eastern borders. And I think Ukraine had managed to avoid plunging into civil war, internal war, or a conflict with Russia in the 1990s, when it was the real danger zone, right? When we had all the conflicts in the Caucasus and in the Balkans. This meant that European policymakers could have invested much less resources to regulate the really existing tensions in Ukraine internally, but also with Russia. And this was not done.
So what do countries that are very directly impacted by all of this, but not militarily, what do countries like, well, Moldova and Armenia, and even Georgia, I mean, yes, it has applied for EU membership, but it is not talking about NATO anymore. It is not blaming Russia for this war in the way that it otherwise might have done 10 years ago. How do they now approach Europe from where they're sitting? What will change in Europe's perception of them? Because they still all need aid, huh? They still all need aid. They still all need engagement in all of these other European structures, if not outright membership in the two main ones.
I think Europe is forced today to pay more attention to those countries, whether it's Moldova, Georgia, Armenia.
You mean it would be the wise thing for Europe to do?
No, politically they will be forced because there's a war in Ukraine and they cannot ignore those countries. But the risk, especially for Georgia, for example, but also for Moldova, as well as Armenia, is that those small countries, their interest is always to try to balance between the great powers that are around them, and those countries manage to keep their stability when they are not forced to choose, and they maximize their interest when they can play on the both sides. Certain collaboration with Russia, but also collaboration with European Union. And this was the big disaster that broke the back of Ukraine, right? When Ukraine in 2013, 2014 was forced to choose either the EU proposed civilizational choice as it was framed by Brussels, or Russia. And even a country as big and as important like Ukraine, when you force them to choose, then you create internal tensions and then great power competition. So I think those smaller countries have even more interest to develop very sharp diplomatic sense, to minimize risks and to maximize collaboration, both with the East and with the West. I mean, Russia today is in a very deep trouble. Russia will pay the price of this stupid and criminal decision to invade Ukraine, but Russia will stay there. And those states, Georgia, Moldova, Armenia, even Ukraine in the future, if we want to see a stable and prosperous Ukraine after the Russian troops withdraw from Ukraine, then we cannot imagine but a certain kind of collaboration with Russia. And this is in the interest of all those in-between countries.
When you look at the situation from a place like Armenia, where the victimization by the neighbor Azerbaijan continues, even at a time when there's supposed to be a ceasefire, and when Armenians are witnessing certainly a lack of Russian attention, certainly continuing lack of European attention, and at the same time, really also seeing that at the end of the day for Ukraine, although there is a lot of vocalizing and sympathy, there is no outright defense. Ukrainians are dying. Everybody else is talking. What and how does Armenian diplomacy move forward in order to still seek a place in this European world without, of course, being antagonizing Russia? Let's leave the Russia part of it out for the moment. But I guess what I'm saying is that a Europe that is too busy elsewhere and that has not demonstrated sufficient interest or capacity to engage as much as Armenians would like. Now, given that scene, how do Armenians engage? What does the Armenian leadership do? What does it have to sell?
Now, Europeans are interested in buying more energy, especially natural gas from Azerbaijan. This is good news for Baku, but also this means that Baku has huge interest in Europe. And we know that, Azerbaijani state budget is largely financed by oil and gas from Azerbaijan going to European markets. And we know that Azerbaijani financial interests are in European capitals. So of course, Europe is interested in Azerbaijani energy more than before, because there will be less Russian energy flowing westwards. But also this means that Azerbaijan is also exposed to European political influence. And we saw that if Europeans decide, they can impose sanctions that hurts Russian economy, and especially Russian banks and Russian financial interests. And I think this could be a very efficient instrument that European decision makers have to restrain Azerbaijani leadership from committing crimes against humanity, from realizing their project, which today it's openly said, right? If we listen to Mr. Aliyev, he's saying that I want Karabakh, but I don't want the Armenian population of Karabakh. He wants to realize ethnic cleansing of Karabakh Armenians. So Armenian diplomacy has its homework to do, to go and talk to European decision makers and to tell them, are you going to be accomplices in this crime, or are you going to use the influence you have in Baku to put conditions that Azerbaijani oil and gas comes with conditions that there are no crimes against humanity tolerated anymore?
The conditionalities that Europe has placed in the past on countries that have indicated some interest in European integration, whether it's just at the Council of Europe level or deeper with the EU and NATO. The conditions that have been placed, human rights, reforms, civic reforms, improved civic engagement, the standards are there, but the imposition, the actual demand for their execution has been wishy-washy at best in certain countries, including Azerbaijan. Now, is that something that Europe will feel it has more of a right to do? Is that something that will be a collateral benefit to the peoples of these countries? That is, their governments will be more seriously engaged in reforms because that is what Europe will want.
European diplomacy in the East, including in the Caucasus, South Caucasus, was very transactional. So basically, they said, if you want to join European institutions, European Union, you have to respect certain set of values, and you should apply certain legal reforms in your country. What concerns Azerbaijan or Russia, though this transaction didn't take place. So basically they said, we collaborate with you economically, and we don't really care what you do in regard of respecting basic human rights and universal values. And I think the current crisis in the East, the war that we are witnessing in Ukraine, was largely the result of this. This concept of we just buy Russian oil or Azerbaijani gas and we don't care about the rest is not functional anymore. And I think there are many European countries that have internal laws that prohibit them from collaborating with companies, with multinationals, with banks, and with states that violate massively human rights. So there's a big field which is there, and I think today politically people will be much more ready to listen to this kind of criticism after the huge failure and the disaster that we are witnessing in Ukraine. I think there will be a new chance for talking about human rights. And there's a new opportunity to criticize dictators, because we are witnessing today that the Putin or Lukashenko model is a model that leads us to a disaster sooner or later.
My last question, unless you have other things you would like to add, my last question has again to do with this these binary relationships that seem to be either defaults or imposed on certain countries. Let's start with Europe. Europe itself gave itself the right to be integrated in various ways with Russia economically, whether in the energy sector or other sectors. Smaller countries like Armenia have often been placed in a position to choose. including economically. So many infrastructural and other sectors in Armenia are Russian owned or dominated, and that's not good. That is perceived as something not good by the rest of the West. Now we have a situation where the pundits, the scholars, the chattering classes, the intellectuals, however we want to view them, are saying, look, these being forced to take sides is not going to work, has not worked, and should not be imposed. And that is something that perhaps will also extend to countries like Armenia, even at a time when within the Armenian world, there are many, especially among the liberals, who are saying, look, the West is useless. The values are just talk, but there's no defense of those values when it comes to people like us. The only thing we can do is throw in everything we have with Russia.
No, I think there's always a space for having a very nuanced and complex diplomacy, foreign policy.
You say that, but is the West seeing that?
Yes, look at Turkey, look at Israel, look at even Azerbaijan. I mean, Turkey up to now has not joined the sanctions, has financial and banking relations normally continuing with Russia and trade and so on. So Israel is another example. So why not Armenia? So the space is there. We should also say that Armenian leadership in the last 20 years has also cornered itself by putting all its eggs in one basket. And we know that Armenia today is very dependent on Russia. And we also know that this huge dependence on Russia, both from the perspective of security, but also in its having all its basic and fundamental infrastructure owned and managed by Russian companies. So all this is not very healthy, and Armenia missed the possibility of having more balanced foreign policy, in spite the theory that Armenian foreign policy was supposed to be multivectoral. So I think now the war gives yet another chance to Armenia to try to persuade, but also establish concrete, multipolar and multivectoral relations. And I'm not just thinking in the direction of the West and specifically Europe, but also towards the South and the East. Armenia has largely ignored this huge space and this incredible continent that is rising, which is Asia. So yes, Europe will try to put pressure on Russia, but this doesn't mean that it will impose a black or white foreign policy to each and every country neighboring Russia.
Well, thank you, Dr. Vicken Cheterian, for really helping us just scratch the surface of the diplomatic and foreign policy challenges that are going to be facing every country, and of course, also Armenia in the short term, in the years to come. Thank you for joining us again for this conversation, Vicken.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for following this limited series that we're calling Ukraine, Armenia, and War as part of the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies Unpacking Armenian Studies series. Our attempt has been to try to draw the parallels and to look at the nuances, the similarities, the parallels, and sometimes the openings that have been made, that have come about as a result of this horrendous war that we are watching every day. Thank you for following the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies. These podcasts are available on all of the platforms that you visit. We hope that you will share them and that they will help you and all of us in exploring these challenges further. I'm Salpi Ghazarian.
You've been listening to Unpacking Armenian Studies, a podcast series on the Institute of Armenian Studies channel. This episode has been produced by Sadin Habesyan. Music by Josue Gonzalez. For more from the USC Institute of Armenian Studies, go to the Institute's YouTube channel to hear dozens of talks by scholars from all over the world. You can reach the Institute at armenian@usc.edu and follow the Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. This podcast has been recorded at the University of Southern California, Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences.